Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to the panelists for sticking so in such a disciplined way to the time. I appreciate it, and I know that the audience does as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a mic in the middle of the room. We are now moving to the Q&A. Any topic that has been raised by the panelists, or indeed any topic not raised by them, but which is relevant to discussion of the issues raised by the CNOOC-Nexen deal, is entirely in order. Please queue up at the microphone. I'm going to ask you please to be sure to introduce yourself. And of course, a brief comment is always in order, but please, we only have about half an hour, and I'd like us to move expeditiously to questions, if we could, so that the panel can respond. Please.
QP. My name is Bruce Heyer. I'm the independent member for Thunder Bay Superior North in the House of Commons. This has been fascinating. For me, the much bigger question, the Nexen, is do we really want communist China to control a piece of a key national resource? But even bigger than the China question, as big as that is the real question for me is who will invest in controlling key Canadian resources and infrastructure generally, especially media, telecommunications, transportation, and energy, and especially energy. Eastern Canada is now dependent on imported oil, more expensive than what we are exporting. We have this bizarre national policy where we buy high in the east and we sell low in the west. Mark Carney has commented on this a number of times. Clearly, for me anyway, and many Canadian citizens, we need 100% energy security for Canadian industries and Canadian citizens before we increase exports, especially the export of low-value raw bitumen to communist China. So that's my comment, feedback from any of you.
Okay, I wonder, panelists, if you would agree that we might take questions from the three people at the microphone now. Please make notes about the question, and then I'll let each of you respond to the points that you wish to answer, and I think that way we'll get more chance for people at the microphone to intervene. Matt, please introduce yourself. Yeah.
Matt Buffton with the Institute for Liberal Studies. I have a question for the panelists in that the Harper government is obviously very interested in promoting a business-friendly idea, and although I'm somewhat skeptical of the restrictions on the Canadian company being able to sell to foreign investors, whatever their ownership might be, it seems to me in the broader context that to deny, in the face of the previous denials of the transactions, to deny another one would sort of undermine the message the Harper government is trying to project with the business tax cuts and a lot of the work that Brian's been doing, talking about our fiscal situation here in Canada. So I'm wondering if you think the broader context of the previous two denials of purchases should be considered in this situation.
Thank you, Matt. Elizabeth, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party, member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands, and future leader of David Kilgour, whenever he decides to join up. The CNOOC-Nexen deal, which is the topic this morning, takes on an entirely different characteristic if the China-Canada Investment Treaty is ratified, which right now it's a lock. There will be no vote in the House of Commons. There will be no debate in the House of Commons. It is going to be done. I see Roger looking up. This is something in Canada called the Royal Prerogative, which is now held apparently by our Prime Minister. He signed the deal in Vladivostok in early September, announced the deal months earlier in February on a trip to China. Canadian parliamentarians had their first look at it when it was tabled September 26th in the House, and then it's a routine matter of 21 sitting days until it's automatically ratified, which will take place at the earliest on November 2nd. The CNOOC rights that then are invested in CNOOC and any other Chinese investor are guaranteed for a minimum of 15 years. Should a future government try to get out of the deal, it's much harder than getting out of NAFTA. It takes a 1-year written notice, and any Chinese investment that's taken place to the point of written notice gets a further 15 years protection. Protections include the ability to launch damage claims against Canada. So it's basically, unlike in NAFTA where it's private sector corporations that can sue under Chapter 11 of NAFTA, this is essentially a state-to-state arbitration for money. China's now suing Belgium for $3 billion, just to give us a sense of what can happen here. So if we were to change, staying with CNOOC, the rules of the game by which CNOOC operates, say Fort McMurray passes a bylaw they don't like. If they think the bylaw is arbitrary, they sue Canada, and it's entirely secret. Canadians need never know anything about it. The first phase of this process, different from NAFTA again, is 6 months of diplomatic wrangling. And if Canada doesn't cave after 6 months of China leaning on us privately, then we move on to in a hotel room somewhere where 3 arbitrators will decide how much money Canada owes or if we don't owe anything. And there is no requirement for any of this to ever be public. What the hell is going on? That's my question.
Good. I see David at the microphone. Let's take his question, and then I'll open things up for the panel to respond to the points that have been raised. David.
Thank you. David Harris, lawyer, Director of Intelligence at the Insignia Strategic Research Incorporated. My question would be largely for Mr. Robinson, a reaction. There is increasing concern amongst those involved in intelligence as they look at Nexen, but at other situations, concerning the apparent tendency of former prime ministers, former senior bureaucrats in post-employment context to go racing off at the first conceivable opportunity to China and presumably benefit from, in some way, their past experience. This has possible implications, of course, for the integrity with which various decisions are made at the highest levels, and not simply at the highest levels of government. I would very much appreciate and enjoy Mr. Robinson's reaction from an American perspective, and also from that perspective, and in specific relation to the Huawei proposal. There is a concern building there as well, that we might find that owing to various forms of cooperation between Huawei that have been reported and various Canadian enterprises, including Bell and TELUS, that we might find Canadian enterprises tainted in the view of American legislators for the purposes of related Canada-US trade and associated relations. I'd be grateful for a comment on those points. Thank you.
Great, thank you. There's some very interesting questions raised by the audience. I'd like to turn to the panel now. Please don't feel obliged to speak to every point. Just concentrate on those where you have something to say. David, would you like to start?
Well, yeah, those are mostly statements. The question goes to our American friend, David. Yeah, Elizabeth, I didn't know much about the legal system in China, and I don't suspect a lot of people know about the legal system in China, but Clive Ansley, does anyone know that name, by the way? Mm-hmm. He practiced law in Shanghai for 14 years. I think he had 300 cases in their courts. What caused Clive to leave China to come back to Canada was that an edict went out, I don't know whether it was by email or whatever, but that no foreigner was ever again to win in a Chinese court, in quotation marks. And as Clive has pointed out, and he's written this in the BC Lawyers magazine, that courts in China are theaters, ladies and gentlemen. What Clive says is that the 2 or 3 judges sitting at the front hearing the so-called evidence and don't decide the cases. The people who decide the cases are the committee of senior judges who meet on a Wednesday morning, and they say that this case is coming up next week on a Tuesday. The result will be this, the penalty will be that. And so that the judges who sit in these courts, as if they're listening, and they probably are listening, they simply get up and read the judgment that's been handed to them. And those of us who are lawyers find that a little bizarre. And I don't know whether, Elizabeth, this is what's going to apply if this agreement goes ahead, but you can be sure that the legal system in China is not good, put it mildly. Anyway, I'll take the others as representation. Thank you very much for saying what you did, Elizabeth.
Since it was a specific question directed to Roger, I might ask Roger to speak next.
Well, first and foremost, this business about a revolving door of government officials moving into industries and working for sovereign entities, in the case of China, very soon after leaving their posts, obviously begs questions and concerns. You had the most flagrant example of this in the world that I know of when the German Chancellor Schroeder went to work for Gazprom I mean, you know, I had a chance to allude briefly to the scale of the Siberian gas pipeline dispute in the Atlantic Alliance. For Gerhard Schroeder to go work for Gazprom for 7 figures is a shocking event by any measure. And it tells you an awful lot about the German positions that he administered at the time. Obviously, it begs the question as to whether there was some nest feathering or at least a mental process about the coziness of that relationship that may have influenced his decision-making. So with that as a guide, it seems to me that if you do have senior officials in this country that are, in fact, seeking employment in Chinese state-owned entities, soon after being in a regulatory oversight or otherwise decision-making process with respect to Chinese investment in Canada, for example, that's not good. And it should have an embargoed period. We have 1 year in some circumstance, in others it's even more in the United States, but it probably is a multi-year event that would be recommended in that connection to just tamp down those temptations, which can be debilitating, particularly from a national security point of view. So I think that's part one of the question posed to me. The second has to do with our friends at Huawei and the implications of some $400 million worth of business that they've been able to successfully conclude with Canadian telecommunications companies. That's a pretty surprising development for those of us in the United States that look at these issues. I don't think I need to elaborate very much as to why. That's been fairly well publicized, particularly with the House Intelligence Report. And whether you think that Mike Rogers and his team are alarmist or raising gratuitous concerns or whatever, I can tell you as one who's seen the intelligence traffic in that congressional capacity on the China Commission, it's not a good story. It is of concern. And the question comes, if there is Chinese equipment embedded in some of these large telecommunications companies who inevitably will seek to do business in the United States, not all of them, but some of them are going to obviously have and do have very established relationships in the United States, there is a legitimate concern there. The Congress and others are, in the light of this report, and in general, are looking closely at these issues. We're going after bank shots now in the United States. We're looking at who's doing business with radioactive companies, and or that might be viewed as radioactive by some, which is a polite way to put it. And they will possibly look askance at such Canadian entities that could impair their ability to take full advantage of opportunities in the U.S. market. So this could be some collateral damage associated with going for the cheapest solution or whatever might be the impetus for concluding these deals.
Thank you, Roger. Gordon wanted to
Very briefly,
intervene.
I'm actually delighted that when I left government, I went to work for a university. I think it poses fewer challenges, perhaps, in the eyes of some. I think there actually are rules, in fact, in Canada, in terms of, which have been strengthened by the current government in terms of, for civil service, at least when you leave government. There's a couple of remarks. China comes with a lot of baggage, of course, and it's viewed negatively by a good portion of the Canadian population. We at the China Institute at the University of Alberta do annual surveys. We've got one coming out next week. It's true that when you touch on SOEs, the support for collaboration, economic cooperation with China drops off fairly sharply. But the Albertans see 76% of the population in favor of oil exports to China. That's a pretty strong figure. It's partly, I think, because it is the keystone industry in that province and there is remarkably strong support. When I hear from Easterners about the fact that we should ship oil east, I think that's great, as long as it's done on an economic basis, seen from an Albertan's perspective. And we're very mindful of the fact that we're now exporting almost all of our oil, 98%, 99% to the United States at discount rates. We'd like that to change. We need an Asian export option That includes China, but also includes India and every other major economy in that region. I know that there's impression is that Nexen is a wonderful target and a great catch. I'm not always sure of that. I mean, Opti, which was purchased by CNOOC a little bit earlier, was on the cusp of bankruptcy. It was couldn't meet its debts and would have gone into bankruptcy if it had not been rescued, in effect. And at least some money flowed to the note holders and to the shareholders. That would not have been the case otherwise, perhaps. Nexen has had and has serious cash flow difficulties. It's got a lot of territory to oil holdings to develop. The majority outside this country, quite frankly. It's a Canadian company, yes, but with 2/3 of its holdings outside. Just briefly on the FIPA, and I greatly respect the comments by two members of Parliament today. That is a saga. I worked on that from very on and off in my time in foreign affairs, a difficult file. The biggest problem that Canadian companies faced in China was, and it's been alluded to here, reliance on the Chinese court system in terms of, do you really want to go to arbitration? Do you want to go to a Chinese court as a Canadian corporation if you've been somehow, your operations have been curtailed, your assets seized? And the answer was no. And so what on one hand may seem as disadvantageous, if you're a Canadian company, the fact that you can now have a recourse outside of China is an extremely important and positive development. For the Chinese side, quite frankly, I don't see Canada is particularly given to arbitrary expropriation or damaging state actions against private companies. But on the Chinese side, I would submit the risks are far greater. So for Canadian companies, this is an important provision.
You've got her up again.
Very briefly?
Very briefly, just examine what's happened. Canada is not prone to arbitrary expropriations, quite right. But the way the word expropriation has been interpreted through state investor history, particularly around Chapter 11, Canada has lost every time to U.S. corporations that have, for instance, brought a suit against a ban on a neurotoxic gasoline additive. They would not be, in the conventional sense, be viewed as expropriations. I just want to add that point.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Ray, you were wanting to intervene.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments, because there's been some significant parallels to, again, my previous life. I'm obviously of the view that there is a significant risk or threat of foreign interference should a company like CNOOC take control of a significantly large entity like Nexen, but it's just that question of, is it just the one-off? Do Canadians examine that as a one-off event, or do they look at this as part of a larger strategic plan that's moving forward? There certainly are inequities, as Dave Kilgore certainly said. I think the references to Chinese courts are important ones. Again, as part of that series of considerations in terms of what you have to be fearful of or be concerned about. But going back to my experience, I know there was a lot of heat taken by organizations like CSIS because it had to, in order to protect Canadians, keep them safe and secure, engage with a number of organizations, security organizations in parts of the world which had, shall I say, a less than stellar human rights record. Some would say you should not engage with these organizations or people because they're just bad and they do terrible things to people. They probably do in some cases, but perhaps not all. But not engaging them is not an option in terms of keeping Canadians safe. And secondly, I do believe that by engaging them, you can help transform what they do and how they do it. And I think they can learn best practices and they can be brought to account on certain things. And that's why I'm certainly not very doctrinaire about those particular positions. Roger made several really important comments that I fully subscribe to. The Huawei one is one where I would nuance, and I think it's very reflective of the Canadian approach to these sort of things. I have been extremely hawkish on absolutely no way should Huawei have any access to any government privileged information networks. I believe when it comes to having access to the larger telecommunications infrastructure, I think, again, it's a very much more manageable set of risks. It's more reflective of the idea that I know from a signals intelligence perspective or from an intelligence collection perspective, there's a very, very big variation in terms of the risk and threats, and companies have to make a very different calculus in order to be able to be successful in what they do. So I think there's a rationale that I think is supportable from a security perspective. The last thing I would say, though, in terms of national security is I'm not sure, though, if the Investment Canada Act is sufficiently weighted to consider the issues of national security. and that to me is problematic. There's attempts, I think as far back as 2009, to try to strengthen that piece. There's been resistance to it in the sense of, do we give a proper definition of what is national security, what is a national security risk in the context of investment in Canada? And from somebody who feels very comfortable working in gray, I think gray is sometimes much more useful than black or white, because the world is a complicated place and every decision should be reflective of the actual event or the evidence at hand. But I do believe that perhaps some more discussion, I think the efforts done by the MLI today really do help put those issues forward, and I think that would be useful for
Thank you,
communities.
Ray. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we did say that we would carry on the question period till 9:30. I'm glad to see that another member of Parliament is coming to the microphone. Just before you ask your question, Jeff, please let me invite other people who would like to ask a question. I take 2 or 3 questions again, and then let the panel respond if there are other questioners. I see somebody else coming to the mic. So if we could get 2 or 3 people, that would be terrific. Jeff, could you introduce yourself and ask your question, please?
Thank you very much. Jeff Regan, Member of Parliament for Halifax West, Liberal Party industry critic. The title for today's session, of course, includes national security. It also includes national interest. And naturally, with the nature of the panel, the focus has been on national security and not on the issues around national interest. Questions like, are there sectors of our economy we ought to maintain a certain percentage Canadian held? And that's a different issue. Are there companies we ought to maintain with maximum limits for foreign ownership, putting aside the whole question of foreign SOEs or Chinese SOEs in particular? But I want to ask, having said that, you might want to comment on that in the same way, but my main question is about what you see as the vulnerabilities in terms of national security when it comes to Nexen and the assets that it has. To me, to think about the telecommunications system and having equipment of the nature we're discussing and the way that Mr. Robertson's described it in our telecom system, which is used by thousands of companies who, the question arises, is their data, therefore, and their communications more vulnerable because of that? But when it comes to Nexen, I consider the fact that its assets, while being primarily foreign held, the assets in Canada include a majority holding in the Long Lake Oil Sands Project, includes a shale gas play in northeastern British Columbia, includes, I think, a fairly small gas-fired electricity plant. They're not running the electrical system in our country, they're not running nuclear plants and so forth. I'd like your thoughts some more about what are the vulnerabilities specifically in relation to national security of a company like that. And the other thing is that what are your concerns about whether or not, or to what degree, Canadian law will apply when it comes to labor issues? I mean, the concern you have about, I actually did a course in law school that looked at the Chinese legal system. It's probably changed a bit since then, although it sounds not much, and I'm not surprised if it hasn't changed much, frankly. But it seems to me that if something happens in Canada, I expect Alberta law and Canadian law to apply as appropriate. So I'd like your thoughts on what the dangers are.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm sure it was just a year or 2 ago that you were in law school. So your knowledge would be quite current. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Byron Allen, Natural Resources Canada. A couple quick questions. The first is, and someone alluded to previously, but I'm wondering if you could address, or any of you, does the debate change if this is, we're talking about Suncor with major Canadian holdings versus Nexen? And another one mostly to Mr. Boisvert, kind of following along your lines of the mass line collection info, I think is how you coined it. Do Chinese SOEs compete against each other, or do they work together to collect information along the lines that you mentioned? And finally, a little bit of a conspiracy theory, and I wondered if you have any views on this. I heard this mentioned in passing a couple times. Does this deal, is there any chance that the deal that we're talking about has anything to do with foreign policy and trying to create a rift between Canada and the US instead of a business deal? Good. I agree it's some conspiracy theory aspects to it. I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we have one last questioner, and then we'll turn it over to the panel. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, Andrew Maida with Bloomberg News.
A question for you, Mr. Boisvert, just to follow up on your presentation. Within the context of an Investment Canada Act review, how likely is it that at the moment CSIS is being consulted in that review? Secondly, if it would be put point blank to you, whether you think the deal should be blocked, what would be your response? And what would be your specific reasons? I mean, you mentioned a range of reasons. You talked about transparency. You talked about some other issues. What, if you could boil down the national security risk to one or two factors, what would you boil it down to?
Okay. Now,
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I will remind everybody that I asked journalists to hang on for the scrum at the end. I'm not objecting to Ray answering the question, but I do want to make sure that, since you'll have another opportunity to ask questions at the end, that people in the audience get their turn. So I think we've got some very good questions there. Sorry, were you waiting to ask a question? No? Good. Then over to the panel.
Yeah, well, I was going to make a couple of comments about some of the other answers. Gordon, I'm all together with you that the Albertans are always right, and when 76% of them want to sell oil and gas to China, by all means sell the oil and gas, but don't sell the company. Satya Das, who's a highly respected Albertan, has written that the oil sands are worth probably $4 trillion at, I guess, current prices. So if we can't keep ownership of companies like Nexen, something's wrong.
It is the longer term play here that should be carefully looked at. It is noteworthy that Long Lake, is an impressive reserve. I mean, it's a good thing that it remains in the ownership of Alberta, but it gets back to points that Elizabeth was making earlier on certain weaknesses in the FIPA and weaknesses in the arbitration issue in particular. But you notice that that deal wasn't signed for 2 decades for a reason, and all of a sudden it is. And it seemed as though Canada moved away from some of its traditional requirements on that investment treaty, or not investment treaty, but agreement, and did accommodate Chinese priorities at some level here. And it is to say that it's a very high threshold, a very complicated event. If things start to go wrong, or if you sense the politicization of this transaction in any way, or remembering that the parent company, China Inc., itself could engage in activities in whether it's the East China Sea or elsewhere that are wholly inconsistent with, alliance, common security concerns, which also could be a factor in the way this ultimately plays out. I mean, I think you do have to look at the Chinese government as the parent company, and therefore they have to be part of that risk calculation. Now, again, that gets down to a fundamental. Do we believe, I mean, it's like the question that presidential candidates ask, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? I mean, this is one of those moments where you have to ask, what is the trend line on China today? Is it looking like it's on a positive, constructive, more open trajectory? Now that they're going into global capital markets, they're moving into foreign procurement programs, they're making investments in national assets, which I would consider this to be in Canada. You'd think that this would inspire governance, transparency, disclosure, reliable statistics, greater attentiveness to the rule of law, and transparency more broadly. The point is it hasn't. And that's troubling. So when you look at the question of what trajectory is China on, I frankly see an ascendant PLA that's going to complicate a civilian decision making to a greater extent, make it less predictable. I see a certain belligerence in a slow growth China that's looking for external letting steam out of the pot kind of nationalism that's been on display vis-a-vis the Japanese in particular. it's not really a positive set of circumstances. And I think that, you know, everybody has to answer that one candidly and honestly. And I just don't see it as a positive trend line. And so when you play this out over time and you look at what's going to happen in terms of the queue in searching out these major resource and other transactions within Canada by Chinese state-owned enterprises and even private ones that at least purport to be private, you need to be very alert to the big picture. And I don't think that the big picture is favorable to Canada at this time.
Thank you very much, Roger. Gordon's been anxious to get in, please.
Well, just a couple of points.
I'll just point out we've got 5 minutes left.
I'll take
so.
two max.
Yep, perfect.
One of the problems, again, I would argue certainly for the big picture here, looking at China exclusively in the security dimension, focusing on the most negative elements of Chinese behavior, and there you can find those certainly. You end up with a very distorted national perspective, whether you're talking from the United States or from the Canadian perspective. A couple other quick points. One, Long Lake has flaws, but frankly, Opti tried for a very long time to make that oil flow properly, and if you followed, as I did, the ups and downs, they're mostly downs. That has not been a very successful oil play. There may be structural problems that make the SAGD process particularly inefficient in the case of Long Lake. Argument can be made that China CNOOC is significantly overpaying, 60+% premium. That's a lot of money to pay for Nexen, which has its challenges. It will certainly, though, if they're going to pay that kind of premium, it'll certainly raise the value of other corporations and put a lot of money into the pockets of investors, both foreign and domestic, pension funds, RSSPs, et cetera. On the FIPA question, I think David in a way makes his own case. Certainly there have been cases, and when I worked in the embassy, there were several where companies lost assets due to arbitrary state action. FIPA is meant to protect that. So that company, when it does lose its assets, it has somewhere to turn. There is a legal environment and there is arbitration. So you can't have it both ways. You complain about the fact that there is no recourse and then be unhappy when there is a recourse. Now, when that's ratified, and I believe it will be, there will be a recourse for Canadian companies. And to get into the who has given what, again, I have been part of that negotiation for a very brief part of that long 18 years. Although I was in government for all of those years, there had to be given on both sides, and there was. I mean, Canadian negotiators, I'd like to believe, are not stupid. We got certain things out of it, and we gave certain things away. That is the nature of international negotiation, and there's prices and there's benefits in that. I think we're better with a FIPA than without. If I was an investor in China, I'd sleep better for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Last word to you, Ray.
Sure, I'll try to weave in some of those threads, especially on the clearly on the national security front. One of the things that worry me in terms of defining what then is at issue, what is the threat? Well, it is partially this lack of ability to engage China in the same way that Canada would be able to deal with a privately held company or a publicly traded company. CNOOC statement a little while back about being it's seeing itself as a sovereign mobile territory is rather disturbing. I'll perhaps go back to a point Roger raised here in terms of inconsistencies. That's an important play in terms of a factor with respect to the whole threat piece. There's an interesting little set of inconsistencies in terms of the values piece, how the PRC manages its foreign policy, defense, and security parameters. There'd be a number of inconsistencies with Canadian values and a number of North American and Western societal values. That's problematic to me. Finally, there's also this issue of intellectual property. And Gordon makes some great points to support my view that I think you're quite often better off engaging, but just do so with your eyes wide open than you are then withdrawing and then and remaining isolated from the global challenges that we all face. But at the end of the day, what quite often gets sold to China, at least in the past, has been copied. So selling things and engaging things comes with a number of risks. So you have to be able to be well prepared to manage those risks. And I think there are a number of effective tools. You just have to be thoughtful about it and think it through and properly measure those risks without being alarmist about it as well. I think that's an important point. I do concern myself as well that the PLA is also, you're right, on ascension, and it reminds me of where another large number of SOEs reside, which is in Russia, and where the kleptocracy has emerged, where former KGB types have almost complete control of some of the greatest assets of the country. So I think as a result, all these sort of factors play in. I'll follow up on some questions after. I'm not sure about the Investment Act. You'll have to ask CSIS whether or not to give any advice. I suspect there's room for that because that's what they do. But at the end of the day, I am worried about conspiracy theories as well. I think that's a good point, and I think sometimes China does work towards a very long-term strategy, and that's another factor Canadians have to keep in mind.
Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all of you and of MLI, I'd like to thank our panelists for what I think was an extremely stimulating discussion.